Thank you. Good morning, everybody, and let me first convey my thanks to CAPS for inviting me and giving me the honor to chair this thematic session, which is supposed to set the stage for India and the global south. We have with us an extremely distinguished panel. We have Ambassador Kantha, who will be talking about China, and I think China is a key element in terms of how the term Global South has come about. We have Radhe Tambi, who will be talking about our own region, the Indian Ocean states, and its relevance in, or how it relates to India's appreciation and possible role in the Global South. And we have Ambassador Pankaj Saran, who was also our Deputy National Security Advisor and has had, like Ambassador Kantha and me, nearly 4 decades of experience in the Indian Foreign Service and thereafter working on strategic issues. And he will be talking about regional alliances or partnerships or whatever term he would like to use. I don't know whether he'll call them alliances or not, as at least we understand alliances in the military sense of the term. But before we get into that, and also what I have requested all of them to do is to speak for about 8 minutes or thereabouts in their opening comments, and thereafter we will sort of try and make it a more interactive session and invite questions from all of you who may like to just, and as we point out, you can take the floor, just identify yourself, and in case some of the people at the back want to ask questions, there are plenty of chairs here. They can either, I don't know if there are mics in the hall, but otherwise you can just come down and take a mic and ask your question. So, but the term Global South, what exactly does it mean? I know it has gained considerable prominence in the Indian discourse, especially during our chairmanship of G20. But nobody quite knows how to define it. I mean, how do you actually define it? The Air Chief, in his opening address, he said that the term was first used in 1969 by an American economist called Carl Oglesby. And he said that, well, if I remember correctly, he said that the Global South accounts for 35% of global GDP and 85% of global population. But within that little statistic, there is an enormous amount of diversity. Post 69, the term didn't really catch on. Then the term gets a revival sometime in 1980 with something called the Brandt Commission. Chancellor Willy Brandt of Germany, he was appointed as chairman of the Brandt Commission, and they came out, it was known as the South-South Commission also. They came out with a big report, and then terms like South-South cooperation, Third World, gained a fair bit of currency. Again, if you look at it broadly, it was largely the developing world. And if you look for commonalities in that, it was countries that had a colonial past. They had low levels of economic development. Some of them had very high population densities. And they also suffered from widespread poverty. However, with the end of the Cold War, the term South, also kind of Global South, faded away. And then it gained another resonance sometime around the COVID era because of the whole discriminatory vaccine practices that were followed. And suddenly we found that the rich world was stockpiling vaccines, whereas the WHO, which had the lead role in terms of ensuring equitable supply of vaccines, was facing difficulty in acquiring vaccines for distribution in the developing world. Looking at it today, I would say that it's an enormously diverse grouping, about 140, 150 plus roughly countries. It is diverse in terms of political terms, it is diverse in economic terms, and geographically, of course, it spreads across multiple continents. It is also diverse because some of the global south countries are, they are in the energy market. They are energy exporters. I mean, look at the Gulf countries. They are also capital rich. They invest in other developing countries. If you look at India, in terms of human resource capital, considers itself to be as good as any in the world, at par with many of the top Western countries, if you look at our space program and nuclear issues and other scientific achievements. So, and then look at China. China is both at the cutting edge in terms of a number of technologies. It is both. It's also resource rich, financial resource rich. After all, today, under the Belt and Road Initiative, it is declared to have invested $1 trillion in over 140 countries. So how do you define this global south? Is it just anti-West? And broadly, I would say by West, I don't mean just the Western Hemisphere. I'd say if I look at NATO as one part of West, it would mean 31 countries, or if we count Sweden, which is yet to join formally, 32. Add to this countries like Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, with which the US has formal treaty arrangements. And then you can add countries like Israel, and maybe some of the Gulf countries which also have special treaty arrangements. So roughly 40 plus I would say are countries that are linked to the US. But is the global south something which is anti-West in this sense? Not really. I mean, that's not how we really understand it. And therefore, it is a bit of an ambiguity, according to me. The term non-alignment during the Cold War was relatively easier to define because the bipolarity was sharper. There was an Eastern Bloc, there was a Western Bloc, and there was a non-aligned. So it became easier to define it in terms of where you stood. Although China also preferred to be on the side of the non-aligned, at least initially. But today, it becomes a little more difficult. In another sense, I would say global south are those countries from where people seek to migrate for economic reasons. I mean, that's a new way of putting it. And maybe we can dwell upon that in part of our conversations. But so when we claim leadership of global south, I mean, it is something, is it vis-a-vis China? Because China is the first one having introduced the Belt and Road Initiative, and then having followed it up in more recent years with the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilizational Initiative, etc., which is based on very fundamental principles. Sovereignty, respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, equality, cooperation, and sustainability. I mean, nobody can object to it. And this is motherhood and apple pie. But nevertheless, is it possible to get a better definition? Is it possible to find a way of approaching this concept? Because the concept has achieved a certain ask Ambassador Kantha, followed by Radhe Tambi, and then we'll have Ambassador Pankaj Saran. Thank you.
Thank you, Rakesh. So first, thank you for introducing the topic of Global South. Theme given to me is India and China conflict and cooperation, the way forward. So what I'll do, I'll talk a little bit about our bilateral preoccupation with China, and then also to what extent we can work together on regional global issues, especially those affecting the Global South. As you're aware, we are well into fourth year of the current downturn or crisis in India-China relations, which has also very significantly affected our ability to work together on regional and global concerns. But this is a relationship which needs to be looked beyond its bilateral dimensions against the backdrop of what's happening in China today, its external engagement. So let me offer some observations there, because that will set the stage for how China is looking at India, cooperation with India at this point of time. And my remarks are partly based on my recent visits to China after a gap of 4 years, when I had the opportunity of interacting quite closely with the strategic community in that country. Visiting China after this long hiatus, one got the distinct impression that China, which is coming out of COVID, is very different from China, which entered COVID. We are today dealing with a much more inward-looking China, which is assertive yet anxious, which is ambitious yet paranoid. A country which is much less sure of itself than what was the case in 2019 before the pandemic arrived. It continues to seek very ambitious goals, but it's also mindful of the fact that it has run into very severe economic and geopolitical headwinds. Government will not publicly acknowledge geopolitical headwinds, but talking to Chinese scholars, they privately acknowledged that China has overreached geopolitically and there is need for course correction. On economic side, when government is, Xi Jinping is talking about it publicly, the current downturn is not cyclical. This is systemic, structural and long-term in nature. How it exactly pan out, I'll not go into details of that. This has led to China making significant adjustments in its external relations, especially with the developed countries in last few months. The main evidence was, extensive preparations prior to the meeting between President Biden and President Xi at Woodside, California on 15th November. And the fact that even though outcomes of the meeting were relatively modest, both sides made a very conscious effort to give a very positive spin on what transpired during the summit meeting. And last few months, China and USA have managed to restore a modicum of stability to the relationship. They managed to put a floor under the relationship. Appeared to be in free fall early this year, especially after the so-called spy balloon incident. But it's a tactical truce. structural problems in the relationship have not gone away. Two countries are still engaged in very intensive strategic competition or rivalry. But this is not only USA which has been sort of, I'll not use the term wood, but, in terms of outreach, has been a target of Chinese policy. China has reached out to EU. They just had earlier this month, after 5 years, in-person summit meeting with the EU leadership. Japan, Korea, Xi Jinping visited Vietnam again after a gap of 6 years or so. Australian Prime Minister visited China. In all cases, very deliberate efforts are being made to stabilize relations which had become fraught for various reasons. What we need to notice here, that unlike their outreach to these countries, there is very little evidence to suggest that China is reaching out to India. At least in public domain, there is no such evidence. The fact that Xi Jinping decided not to attend G20 summit in New Delhi, the fact that the position of Chinese ambassadors in New Delhi is lying vacant for 14 months, conveys certain signals to us which we should not ignore. Talking to the Chinese strategic community, one got a very distinct impression, and actually they told us quite bluntly that they are looking at India through prism of their strategic rivalry with USA, which has become an all-consuming preoccupation for them. They have come to the conclusion, the dominant view, there's a minority view which gives India agency, but the dominant view is that India has been co-opted by the USA in its Indo-Pacific strategy, which essentially seeks to contain China, slow down the rise of China. Now, this has implications, very serious implications, on how far China will work with us on various issues, including issues relating to Global South, to what extent they're willing to give space to us on our bilateral concerns or our strategic concerns. A second message which one received from Chinese scholars is that on the border issue, they don't accept a position at all, that until state of borders return to a modicum normalcy, overall relations cannot return to the normal track. They don't accept this linkage, and they would expect us to accept the new normal. In fact, they use this term, which has arisen following Chinese intrusions and activities beginning May 2020, and move on. So this is the message they are conveying to us. There is one more signal that we should take note of. Following the summit meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, China is sending some signals. For instance, last week, talking to media in Tokyo, commander of Indo-Pacific Command of the USA noted that intercepts by Chinese PLA Air Force aircraft of US aircraft has stopped. And this was, he said, a very major development because, earlier intercepts were causing a lot of concern, and they were, in the past 2 years, there were 180 risky and coercive, terms used by him, intercepts of US aircraft and more than 100 intercepts of aircraft of allies and partners. But again, this kind of flexibility is not being shown vis-a-vis other countries in four theaters where China is seeking, pursuing its unilateral territorial claims. Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, East China Sea, and India-China borders. So there's a dual track which we need to keep in mind. There's absolutely no sign of mellowing of Chinese position along India-China borders. I'll not go into details of that. We can discuss it during Q&A if you like. In fact, they, unlike in the past, they have formally ruled out possibility to return to status quo ante. 5 friction points also where we have had the limited disengagement. It has involved creation of buffer zones, which has affected patrolling by our forces to places they were visiting earlier. Depsang and Demchok, they're not even prepared to do that. And they are preventing our troops from patrolling. Like in Depsang, at least 5 patrolling points they are unable to access. In addition to that, they have really stepped up infrastructure building in a big way in different areas. Since CAP's seminar, so one can mention that how since 2017, we had at least 37 airports have been operationalized in Xinjiang and Tibet, and at least 3 of them within 60 kilometers of the line of actual control in Tibet. You have 3 rail lines coming up to Ningchi, Yatung, and Gerong. You have G695, a new highway coming up in Aksai Chin, and a whole lot of other areas. So what we have today is a new situation, which is fundamentally different from situation that obtained before May 2020. And the Chinese are entrenched. They will stay. And we should not work on the assumption that they will limit their so-called grey zone operations, that is engaging in military and economic coercion, staying under the threshold of outright military conflict, only to eastern sector. So this will happen, elsewhere in middle sector, in eastern sector. I have some ideas on what we can do. I'll not go into that because Rakesh has given me only 8 minutes. So I will move on. On bilateral relations, I'll just make 2-3 additional points there. One, when it comes to safeguarding our position on line of actual control, there's need for us to show strategic patience. We should not go for quick fix solutions. We should avoid a solution like what happened in Doklam in 2017, when we thought we have arrived at a breakthrough, but you know what Chinese did after that in terms of entrenching their presence in Western Bhutan. Template we need to follow is what we did after Wangtung. We maintained our position on the ground. We waited for 9 years before disengagement was worked out. So I think need to show patience, need to step up our deterrence, need to build up our capabilities. I think that's very important. In parallel, we need to, while we have to acknowledge that it's a new situation, we will have to maintain force deployment at a much higher level. We can discuss possibilities like force reduction in select areas. There is template for that in agreement of 1996 specifically provided, and it also favors us because it factors in elements like nature of terrain, force induction and de-induction time, infrastructure, border infrastructure, when working out force ceilings. So these dialogues, these discussions can perhaps be revived at an opportune time. On border issue, another suggestion, I feel that we need to return to the earlier template where these negotiations were conducted by composite groups consisting of diplomatic and military experts. Because frankly, Chinese are looking at LAC in territorial terms, in terms of sovereignty now. So we are negotiating territorial issues. This is not something which should, our border commanders should be forced to negotiate. We need to discuss disengagement, de-escalation, and de-induction in a different format as we did earlier. This was a departure from past practice. Last point I would like to make on India-China bilateral relations, that while what we have done in terms of establishing linkage between restoration normalcy in border areas and overall relations returning to normal track is perfectly justified. But we need to engage in more in-depth, more intensive, more strategic dialogue with China, which is absent at present. It has to be both at diplomatic and political level. It can be through back channels. It can be through special envoys. Because, we have structural problems in India-China relations today, which predate Galwan. Our worldviews are different. We Chinese, as was mentioned in the inaugural session, essentially they are seeking hierarchical order, where they would like to emerge as the preeminent power, whereas we would like to see a multipolar Asia, a multipolar world, a more balanced international order. They're not giving us space in our shared neighborhood, whether it's South Asia or Indian Ocean region. They're not, in fact, being supportive of rise of India. Sentiments on both sides have turned really negative in last few years. All this is affecting to what extent we can work together, not only on bilateral issues, but also on regional and global issues. Frankly, given the fact that China is largest neighbor, there is no alternative to a policy of constructive engagement, a policy of dialogue with that country, even though it's going to be a difficult process. Now, coming to issues relating to Global South, this is one area where China is feeling reasonably confident, because assessment on the Chinese side is that the West has managed to alienate Global South in a very big way by its COVID vaccine nationalism, the way they cornered vaccines, by its preoccupation with Ukraine, as if this should be the big issue for the entire world, and now the U.S. policy on Israel-Hamas conflict, and a very one-sided position taken by USA in support of Israel. This has created space for China, which is trying to seize. And already China was very active in terms of its outreach to Global South. Rakesh referred to Belt and Road Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative. So this is one area where China is in fact making gains. And this is one area where there is an incipient rivalry or competition between India and China. January this year, Prime Minister hosted a virtual summit on the Voice of Global South. China was not invited for obvious reasons, because we don't regard China as a developing country belonging to Global South. But China is seeking leadership of Global South. In a way, we are also seeking leadership of Global South. Even while we have tried not to allow bilateral differences to come in the way of our working together in multilateral platforms like BRICS and SCO, or transnational challenges like climate change, the fact remains that our bilateral differences are seeping into our ability to work with China on various issues, including concerns relating to global south. So increasingly, we are on different page on those issues. So I'll stop there. Rakesh is just reminding me that I've completed, I've maybe exceeded my time. So I mean, we have, when you look at global south, uh, this is emerging as the arena for contestation between India and China rather than an area for cooperation.